Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on the Maroczy bind. I'm going to show you a couple games this time, but before I show you the first game, I wanted to say a few words about the pawn structure. So let's put that Maroczy bind position on the board again. So e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes, knight takes, g6, preparing to put the bishop on this good diagonal here. But well, before that, c4, white prepares to play the Maroczy bind. Well, goes for the Maroczy bind by putting the pawns on c4 and e4. Now knight f6, knight c3, d6, f3. It's an early f3, but we'll come back to that. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop g7, bishop e3, castles, queen d2. Let's see, I think I was doing bishop e6 last time, but I wanted to put the bishop here for purposes of illustration. Say bishop e2, queen comes out, castles, say rook to c8 and b3. So now we've got the full Maroczy bind setup. This is what I think of anyway as the Maroczy bind setup with these pawns in this these two diagonals, all focused on the d5 square. So, but I wanted to talk about a couple of pawn structure transformations that can occur from here. One of the more common ones is happens after you put a piece on the d5 square. Now, black can always kick that piece away with e6. That's why I put the bishop here instead of putting the bishop on e6. So, but pawn to e6 leaves the d-pawn weakened. So a lot of times black doesn't really want to play that, particularly if you've got a lot of pressure on this file already. So instead, after the knight goes to d5, black will try and live with that knight for a while, or he will trade it off. And after it's traded, you have a decision how to take back. You can take back with either the c-pawn or the e-pawn. And both of those are feasible in general. But sometimes one is slightly to be preferred over the other. So let's talk about why you might select one or the other. In the previous video, I showed some examples. There are tactics that occur on the C file. So the advantage of taking with the C file, with the C pawn, is it does open up the C file for tactics. And the other advantage is that it opens up this diagonal for the bishop. And there may be some things the bishop can do with that as well. So why would you take with the e-pawn? Because sometimes that's to be preferred. Well, if you take with the e-pawn, it does open up the e-file potentially. I mean, you still have these bishops on the way, but potentially you could get a heavy piece on the e-file. And with this pawn over here, this pawn will become backwards. And if you get some pressure against it, sometimes that can be a target. So taking with the e-pawn creates a target over here. And it does one other thing. Once you've taken with the e-pawn, you have 4 pawns on the queen side, and black only has 3. So there are situations where you can actually get this majority of pawns on the queen side mobile. If you can mobilize them and push them forward, you can sometimes create a passed pawn on the queen side. So that's another way this can evolve. Okay, so that is the d5 square and the exchanges that occur there. The other way you might want to evolve this pawn structure forward is to push. To push the f-pawn, this is just going straight for an attack. Maybe you can even push on to f5 and weaken the king side. Another reason for pushing this pawn is if black has managed to get a piece here, you push that pawn to chase the piece away and take more control over the center squares. And similarly on the queen side, you can sometimes mobilize the queen side with moves like a3, b4, and then push on. So those are the ideas. If the queen weren't here and there were a piece sitting on the c5 square, then sometimes just b4 immediately to chase that piece away is a good idea. So returning this question of the move f3, when I was going through the sequence in the previous video, I said I play the move f3 here, which is not the most popular move. I'm just going straight for this setup. But a reason for not playing f3 right away is that maybe there are times when you can take the pawn directly from f2 to f4 in a single move. and that will actually give your attack on the king side a little more oomph. You know, it kind of gains you a step on the king side attack. And so we will see these ideas played out in the following example games. The first game I'd like to show you was a game played by ChessExplained. This was played on ICC, and it's a rapid game. So the rapid games have a longer time control than the blitz game, so he had a little bit of time to think about his moves. But of course, it's not as slow as a over-the-board game. So there's some inaccuracies. But all in all, I think it's pretty interesting in showing some of the ideas of the Maroczy bind. So let's start off. ChessExplained plays d4 here. And I'll include a pointer to this game. Actually, I have a pointer to this game in the previous video because I mentioned ChessExplained previously, but I'll put a pointer to this game again in this video in the description. Let's see. ChessExplained started with d4. His opponent went knight f6. He goes c4. So classical Queen's Gambit type of opening. If black wanted a Nimzo Indian, black could play with e6, but instead black played with c5. Which is a precursor to, this is Benoni, actually. And the normal move here would be to push the pawn. And then black has the option of playing b5 there, and that would be a Benko gambit. And so what ChessExplained said during the video was he didn't feel like facing a Benko, so he played knight f3. And as a result of this, we end up in a Maroczy bind position. So this shows another way to get to the same kind of position. Black plays with the fianchetto here, which is pretty normal. White just keeps on developing. Bishop g7, e4. So now he's got all three pawns in the center, and black decides to take. It's actually a very logical move with the bishop here. You want to open up that diagonal. Knight takes, and d6. So we've gotten to a typical Maroczy bind kind of position with the pawns here and here, and the d-pawn stopping them, and the fianchetto. And it continues in typical Maroczy lines for quite a bit. ChessExplained goes bishop e2 first, knight c6. Now he doesn't retreat his knight. A lot of times he will play knight to c2, but he's not playing that way in this game. He defends the knight with the bishop, castles, castles, and he gives black an opportunity to do this trade. He takes back with the bishop. This is a trade I would say white usually welcomes. Especially when white can take back with the bishop and oppose this bishop on the diagonal, because this bishop is the pride and joy of black's position. If white can exchange that off, that's I think a minor advantage to white, or it's a positive thing if white can manage to trade that piece off. And black accommodates this with knight d7. Knight d7 is a pretty rare move in that position. A typical continuation here would be bishop d7. That's how white or black would normally continue. But it looks like black is intent on trading, and white could take right away, but there's no rush. This has been played before, by the way. This is a line that's still in the opening book. Bishop takes, king takes, queen d4 check, f6, and then rook a to d1. This seems good for white too. White has good control over the center and good development, centralized pieces. Yeah, it's hard to complain about that position. Anyway, he played something different. He played king h1, which was also, I looked at this with the chess engine. It was recommended by the engine. It's a good move. Why take the initiative and trade that when that bishop is probably going to trade anyway? That was the point of black's play. Although, at this point, black could decline the trade and put the bishop over here on h6, which the chess engine was actually saying, maybe black should try that. But anyway, black had played this way to force this exchange, or to achieve this exchange. And so he does that and pushes on with a5, trying to restrain the queenside pawns there. And here's the point I mentioned. There's no pressure on the center here with black's setup. All his pieces are back here. I mean, the knight might hop into that square, but in general, he's not attacking any of these pawns. This pawn is not under fire. there's no dark squared bishop to take advantage of this weakened diagonal, so why not just push that pawn all the way forward? So Chess Explained got the move f4 in a single move. So you should look for opportunities to do that. Leads to a pretty good position for white. And black plays queen to b6. And now at this point, although Chess Explained will often trade queens in his game, this is a game where he's starting to feel the idea of a kingside attack coming on. He decides to preserve his queen by dropping it back. Knight to c5, good square for the knight. And now it is attacking this pawn, but it's sufficiently defended at the moment, and the bishop could even go there to defend it more securely if need be. And here, Chess Explained thought for a while, and eventually just played the move b3, which, as we saw, is a typical part of the Maroczy setup. And he called this a small improving move. And I think this is one thing I learned from watching Chess Explained in his videos. There are times when you can't really push forward. You know, you want to push forward, but you can't see if it works out to your advantage or not. So rather than making a committal decision like f5, that would be the way to push forward here, you just play a small move that improves your position slightly, and you just wait and see how your opponent responds. Your opponent may make a move that weakens his position. So your opponent may find something that is good and improves his position a lot. But one advantage of playing a position like the Maroczy bind, you have a lot of control over the center. It's going to be hard for your opponent to find those moves that really improve his position. So that's what you're banking on when you play these kind of small moves. Now, in this case, as I mentioned, this was a rapid game, and he didn't have as long to think about it as he would have in a slow or classical time control game. In this particular position, actually f5 does work. So actually this was already a working move. Say black plays king g7, so the rooks can come over to defend. Then just lift the rook here. And then the rooks are coming like this and like this. Black doesn't have a piece over here to defend the dark squares. The dark squared bishop is gone anyway, and his knight is over on the other side of the board. This is looking really dangerous. So this already would have been pretty much a killer attack. Anyway, but he spent some time thinking about it. He could not calculate his way clear to an advantage in that line. And so he just played this small improving move. And I think that's a good practical decision and something to keep in mind when you're playing these positions. You want to push forward. You want to, break things up and get an attack going. But you do your best to calculate those lines. If you can't see your way clear to an advantage, well, you've got an advantage just kind of sitting on the position, and you can do that for a while. Okay, so that was a discussion of the move b3. Anyway, black continues with bishop d7, very normal moves. Now knight d5, putting it on this good square. Very typical of the Maroczy bind, hitting the queen. The queen goes back and defends the pawn. That pawn was under fire. And black lifts his queen up to, Chess Explained, lifts his queen up to d4. Bishop to c6 was played. So this is kind of interesting. We saw lines where the bishop went to e6, but c6, looking at white's king, maybe is an idea. And then Chess Explained played the mysterious rook move, rook a to e1. And this is where, remember I was talking about those exchanges. This indicates that he's thinking of taking this way so that he can have pressure with the rook against the backwards pawn. So let's see, knight to e6 was played here, hitting the queen dropped back to e3, and bishop takes. So black did decide finally to go for that exchange. And it is still playable. C-pawn takes bishop is still playable, but the setup that that white has is clearly aimed at taking with the pawn in the other direction and opening up this file. This also chases the knight away, so there's an immediate, well, there's not an immediate threat because the queen's defending there, but with the rook and the queen, if the bishop were out of the way, there would be a threat to take that pawn immediately. Anyway, the knight goes to c5, good square for the knight, and the bishop steps out of the way with bishop d1. And actually right here, f5 is once again a good move, but he has got an idea here with the bishop, and so he's just going forward that. He didn't pause at this point to consider whether f5 worked, but actually it was already working there again. He went bishop d1. The rook went to e8, so two defenders of that pawn. I mean, that was kind of a forcing move. You expect black to respond to that. And he went bishop c2. He just completed that maneuver with the bishop, and now he's all ready to play f5. And so black beats him to the punch and plays f5 instead. Actually, that was not the best response. Because white took a little too long to get in that f5 move, black could actually get a decent position by pushing e6. A little bit counterintuitive, but because it leaves, I'm sorry, black would take with the rook. It's counterintuitive because it does leave black with this isolated and backwards d-pawn, and I'm sure ChessExplained would have been happy to play this kind of position because he's got the long-term idea of just keeping pressure on that pawn. And yeah, it's something he can play with for a long time, so I'm sure he'd be happy with that. But the chess engine says that black should be able to hold this position, interestingly enough. Anyway, black didn't play that way, but played f5 immediately, which is just directly stopping that f5 pawn push from white, but at the cost of weakening the dark squares a little bit more. So ChessExplained plays with g4 right away. He's got the idea now, and he's going for it. So he didn't get f5 in immediately, but g4 is still targeting that square, and he's got the bishop on it, and it's also difficult to defend here. Once again, e6 needed to be played here, but let's see. Yeah, black played f takes g4, and white is actually just winning after this. White pushes on immediately with f5. G takes. So it looks like he's sacrificed a pawn, but in fact that dark squared weakness comes back to haunt black. Now that these pawns have been lured forward by those two pawn sacrifices, the queen comes in, and it's game over at this point. King goes here, queen takes f5, and now this is a unstoppable battery, and black resigned at this point. So the takeaways from this game, there's two things that stood out in this game for me. One is the idea that, let's back up here. One is the idea that you can push the f-pawn forward immediately in a single bound if you forego the f3 move. The other idea that stood out to me was that b3 push, that when you reach a point in the Maroczy bind where you can't make progress, look for small moves that improve your position. Sometimes piece maneuvers too. There are ways to do things, try and keep your opponent off guard without making any committal moves with your pawn structure. And then the third idea was this idea of taking with the e-pawn to open up the e-file for pressure against the backwards e-pawn here. Okay, let's check out the next game. This next game was played in the European Club Cup between Ivan Saric. Oh, that's a classical time control game. It was played in November of 2019 between Ivan Saric and Magyar Peterson. So Ivan Saric is rated 2650, and Magyar Peterson was rated 2464 at the time. So very strong players. 2650 is a GM class player. And Ivan has the white pieces, starts off with e4. Let's just put the opening on the board kind of quickly. We've seen this before. Knight of 3, g6, d4, pawn takes. So black is going directly for a knight c6 here, going for an accelerated dragon. Another way to get to these Maroczy bind positions, very common. Knight of 6, knight c3, d6, f3. He does play the f3 move. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop g7, bishop e3, castles, queen d2, bishop e6, and rook c1. So I showed this position in the introduction, I think even in at the beginning of this video too. And the next move from white I was showing as bishop e2. But there's also rook c1. And both players are following a book line, so we haven't left the opening book yet. Queen a5 was played, b3. So we have the complete Maroczy bind setup, so he hasn't tried to get in anything tricky, no fast pawn moves. Rook f to c8. As I explained, this bringing the rook here, the f rook here, is a way to give the king an escape square here, so that if you ever try this tactic, the king can come here and attack the knight. So this is the most common way of playing this. And now white continues with bishop e2. But white has delayed castling compared to an earlier bishop e2 move. And that's not unique to Ivan here. That's like I said, this is a book line. So we'll see why this delay in castling has happened in just a move here. Black plays a6 and white goes knight a4, still part of the book line, and offers the queen trade. And after queen takes, which is what happened, king takes. So that's why white didn't castle. White was keeping the king in the center. And now we have a very interesting position where it's a queenless middle game. I mean, there's still quite a bit of force on the board. There's 2 rooks and 3 minor pieces. But the king can probably stay in the center. It looks like that's the intent, and we can transition to an endgame where the king will actually be well placed in the center of the board, and this king will be offside. So the reason why I'm showing this game is I wanted to, I said in the introduction that one of White's strategies is just to keep all the pieces on, or as many as possible, and just play a maneuvering game and try to show that the advantage in space that white has will make it difficult for black to find good squares for his pieces or meet all of the threats. But what I want to show with this game is that even if there are substantial trades, we've traded the queens and 1 pair of minor pieces, and we'll see more trades coming up, there's some kind of persistent advantage that white has with this space. He has an advantage in space. And that persists through to the endgame. So you don't need to be afraid if you're white. You don't need to be afraid of trades. You don't need to avoid them at all costs. It's just a strategy to keep pieces on and try and maneuver with your pieces to exploit your space advantage. But that space advantage will persist. And it's a very solid pawn structure. Difficult for black to undermine it. Okay, so let's continue on. Let's see. Knight d7 was played, opening up this diagonal for the bishop and repositioning the knight maybe to a better square. And now g4. White's free to just push those king-side pawns and gain more space. He's going to keep the king in the center. Rook a to b8. And this at this point is actually, we were in the opening book up to this point, but this may be a newer line, I don't know. But the opening book went f5 here. And after f5, e takes, g takes, h3, defending the pawns over here. Rook to f8. So the rook switches back to the f file, f4, and rook a to d8, putting the rook opposite the king, and the knight comes back to c3. And this is still a position where white has some kind of advantage in space, and this knight still has some good squares to look at. Notice that both sides have a pair of bishops, so we can't talk about the bishop pair advantage. Really, the material is completely even, and the advantage that white has is perhaps a better king position, maybe better if you trade into an endgame, and just more space. His pawns are up on the 4th line and controlling some squares on the 5th line as well. Yeah, maybe this pawn is weak. So some slight structural advantage for white, and that's the way this has been played. That's the opening book line. Anyway, black did something different in this game. After what was it? Yeah, white played g4. After g4, black went rook a to b8. He's just thinking of pushing this pawn forward. It's not a bad idea. Undermine these pawns of white. Trying to undermine that strong pawn formation that white has. So white continues knight c3. This knight hops into c5, a good square for the knight. And maybe that was another reason for putting the rook there. So if that trade occurs, Black can take back with the rook and keep this pawn structure. Black's pawn structure is very solid too. That's one thing about these Sicilian pawn structures. They're not taking up much space. They're only on the second and third lines, but they're very solid. Okay, so b4. As I said, you sometimes need to push these pawns forward to chase pieces away. The knight drops, well, the knight goes to d7. And now knight d5. So the knight is placed on that key d5 square, threatening this pawn, and black just takes right away. And so once again, we're faced with this choice of whether to take with the e pawn or the c pawn. In this case, if you take with the e pawn, you could potentially bring a rook over here and move these bishops out of the way and try and get pressure on this pawn. But that's a bit slow. And there is an idea from black to immediately push the a pawn here and start undermining these pawns on the queen side. So you can't really mobilize this queenside majority very easily. Well, I don't know. I guess you have to choose. You have to choose between mobilizing the queenside majority or trying to get pressure on the e pawn. But in any case, it doesn't seem to be as favorable as the previous position. And in fact, white chooses in this game to take with the c pawn. And in both games, the chess engine approved of the way that they were played. So although both ways are playable, in this game it would have been playable for white to take that way. The chess engine prefers taking this way. And in the previous game, we had the opposite situation. The chess engine preferred taking this way, and that's the way that was played in that game. So you can look for these differences. This has opened up the C file. There's not going to be any weaknesses on the pawn structure on the queen side. We'll just have two pawns against two pawns, and this diagonal for this bishop is opened up, although black can try and shut it down with that move. White can undermine with the a pawn. So there seems to be some play for this bishop along this diagonal. And white does not mind the exchanges. As I said, his king is pretty well positioned, so if black decides to trade rooks, white is not going to be upset about that. Let's see, black, what happened here? C takes d5, bishop to b2. Yeah, I was confused for a second. Black plays bishop to b2. Yeah, so black starts to put, to try and chase these pieces around. White just goes for the trade here. Like I said, white was not unhappy with the idea of trading. And then he brings his other rook into the game, attacking the bishop. It's very important to get all your pieces in the game, even in the endgame. Maybe even more important in the endgame. So the bishop runs back. And now white just presses forward with f4. Looks like he wants to keep his rook on at this point and just play on with the rook and two minor pieces. Black plays h6. I think I'm going to go through this section a little bit quickly. Nothing too much is going on. There's just pawns are coming forward. Notice that white maintains his space advantage through all this part of the game. And but black in compensation has some good squares for his pieces. That is going to happen when you play this way. As you push the pieces forward, as you push the pawns forward, sometimes squares will open up for your opponent. You can't stifle all the counterplay all the time. But these advanced pawns may be dangerous in the endgame. And so knight to c4 check, and the trade. So for a while there, white did have the bishop pair advantage, but this knight became too strong a piece, and white decided to trade off. Well, he was going to lose one bishop or the other. He decided to trade off the light squared bishop. And so now both sides have a dark squared bishop and a rook. So it's the same color bishop. It's not like one of those drawish positions with opposite colored bishops, or attacking positions with opposite colored bishops either. Anyway, the king has to step up to defend the pawn, but that's what's good about this centralized king here. He can do that very easily. The rook drops back to c7, and now b5. Just pushing on the queen side, creating some weaknesses. And these exchanges will also potentially create an avenue for the king to get into the game. Although at the moment, this rook is preventing that, but that's an idea for later. rook takes b5, pressure on this pawn, and bishop to e5, hitting this pawn over here. And here's an interesting moment. White ignores this so-called threat, this potential threat here, and plays bishop to d4. So this sets up a little trap for black, and this is the kind of thing you can play when you're just you have no clear plan to win, but you're just kind of poking and prodding. This is, you can try and set up little traps for your opponent and see if they fall for it. So the problem here is that if the bishop takes the pawn, white can push on with a6, and now there's this really big dual threat. If the pawn isn't taken, then it can just come forward and potentially queen. If the rook drops back, then this pawn will be taken at least, and white will have a passed pawn. But on the other hand, if the pawn is taken, if black takes white's pawn, it opens up the back rank, and with a rook here and a bishop here, that's a checkmate. So so black is in big trouble there. He's just losing. He can't play that way. So black just leaves things as they are and starts bringing his king to the center, king f8. This I think this trap still works here, but so white probably doesn't need to play h3, but white goes ahead and plays h3. At some point he's going to have to play that to get that pawn away from being a target of this bishop. This king continues to centralize, and let's go forward to a few more moves to find another interesting point in the game. We see that black is trying to undermine these pawns, so sound strategy from black. Rook to b3, pawn takes, and now we're just down to just 4 pawns, but notice that white's pawns have all advanced to the 5th rank, and black's pawns are being held back. We have the situation where you have 1 pawn holding back 2 pawns over here, but it's still difficult for white to force this pawn through. So no clear winning plan just yet, and we get just some more maneuvering. The king comes over to defend this lone weak pawn over here, frees up his rook. The rook starts to activate. This bishop takes a look at this pawn here, and just a little bit of maneuvering back and forth. Finally, this pawn comes forward, and black dropped the rook back. Maybe he was thinking of bringing it over here to put pressure on this pawn, and white brought his pawn over here, or white brought his rook over here to attack this, and the king defended. But now the rook goes to the h-file, so there seems to be a little bit of pressure on this pawn, but at the same time, with the rook diverted and looking at this pawn over here, the king now has this idea of marching in, as I talked about earlier. So let's see, let's go forward. King comes forward here. This king went to d7. King comes forward to b5, and now bishop to d4 was played. It's kind of a logical move. Keeps that king from stepping forward and attacking this pawn. So the bishop on this line here is a way of protecting that pawn and preventing more pressure from being applied to it. But that actually seems to be the losing move. So this is already a position where black is in some trouble, and I guess it kind of illustrates that principle of just keeping up the pressure and trying to use your space advantage, maneuvering your pieces around it, and setting tactical traps for your opponent. So this is a position where it's difficult for black to find a good move. There are a couple good moves, I'll show them, but to show an example of another move that doesn't work, we'll get back to the game move in a minute. This move seemed like a pretty natural move to me. That was the first move I thought of, and that's a mistake, because you can go here, rook h3, and then the bishop has to drop back. If it actually takes the pawn, there's a pin here, and now it's white's move, and white can play here and just win a piece. So it was not really a threat to take that pawn, and after the rook lift to h3, then the bishop has to drop back. And let's see, Then the king gets to step forward. Let's see, the rook comes over to defend. Bishop to c3. Opposing the bishop here. Bishop takes, rook takes. This seems to be a winning position for white with the rook threatening to come in like this. And just notice the difference in the king position. This is a lot of times a way to win an endgame is just have that great king position. So that was losing. There are moves that hold for black. So, but it seems like it's the kind of position where black can lose or black can draw, but it's very hard for black to win. One move black could try is to play f5, and I looked at this a little bit. It got really complicated, but basically the idea is it seems that taking on passant doesn't really help white so much, so white pushes on taking this pawn, and black pushes on with this pawn. So black sacrifices this pawn, but gets counterplay on the f-file. And that seems to be just enough to allow black to hold the game. And then the other way to hold the game here would have been to play after king b5. Let's see. King c7. Defending with the king. That also seems to hold. And let's see, it gives bishop e1 as the next move. But, white will just go back to trying to maneuver his pieces around and find a way to break through, I guess. Maybe the bishop can come to this diagonal and get in here and chase the king away. Something like that. Anyway, still a long game from this point. So white can play on until he gets tired or it gets reduced to a well-known draw. Anyway, so bishop d4, a seemingly logical move. Not trying to grab a pawn, but just trying to keep the white king out of the camp on the queen side here. This loses to this sequence. So rook to f1 was played, putting pressure on the f-pawn again, dragging the king back. Then rook to f4, hitting the bishop. Bishop goes all the way to g1, but stays on this diagonal. Now rook to g4. So just chasing that bishop around. Bishop goes to a7, still staying on the diagonal. And now a6. Breaking through on the queen side finally. With the king away and with this pawn knocked out, the king can step in to the c6 square. So this is a breakthrough. It's actually, after the exchange, white doesn't even bother to take that pawn. This is really a key moment. He leaves that pawn there and goes king c6, and this is the way to play it. You have to be aware that there's a pawn that can queen here, but you have a rook or a bishop that can stop it, and it's quite a few steps away, whereas white's pawns are much closer. The advantage of having pushed those pawns earlier and having more space is that your pawns are closer to queening in the endgame. So black goes for f5 now. White doesn't take en passant, but takes this pawn with check. The rook is hanging, but this goes with check. King goes to f7. The rook goes to b4. Now the rook looking to sneak in this way. Bishop to f2 was played, so that so that he didn't lose the bishop, and trying to keep some control over these squares. But this is already a lost position. The rook comes to b7. King drops back. Rook goes to b8, just to force this trade. He wants to get rid of the rooks, so there's no problem queening the pawn. Oops, I'm sorry, rook b8. King went to h7. Put the king on the wrong square. Rook takes. King takes. And it would have ended up in the same position anyway. The bishop went to e5 with check, clearing the path for the pawn with tempo. King went to g8, d6. Bishop takes the pawn, and then this bishop just goes to f4. So white blockades these pawns, defends this pawn. This pawn is a long way from queening, and this pawn can't be stopped. Even if the king comes over, white's king can step up, and there's no way for black's king to stop that white pawn from queening. So black resigned, and that's how the game ended. So that was a long game, but I think there was a number of interesting points to it. you know, how do you convert these positions where you have a space advantage? One idea is to really just take it all the way forward, maintaining that advantage as best you can, and go for an endgame where you have an advantage like this and you can press. And the other idea, of course, was that decision about which way to take the, you know, it's back up before this point, huh? Let's back up a little more. Right here, the decision about which way to take. This is already always something to consider. And then the way to advance the pawns on the side. This is unique in that normally I see the f-pawn advancing rather than the g-pawn, but this seems to be a nice way of playing it. It keeps a solid structure, and he's still gaining space on the queen side with the, I mean, he's gaining space on the king side with his king pretty safe in the center. So yeah, I guess that's the last lesson I wanted to point out from this game is you don't have to be afraid of these exchanges. You can take this all the way down to an endgame and play for a win in the endgame. In the next video, I'm going to take a look at this same kind of position, the Maroczy bind position, but from the point of view of black. So I'm going to show how black can successfully play against the Maroczy bind. So you have a more rounded understanding of this Maroczy bind position. So I'll see you guys then. Bye.